Science of engagement, just to kind of level set and set the scene for today's conversation. To kick us off, this is where we're going to do our first question or poll for today's activity. We'd like you to rank your resilience challenges. So we've got a couple of options in here around, are you concerned about lack of team engagement across the organisation as it relates to resilience activities? Communications across the organisation, whether that's during response activities, in preparation activities, or some other area. Difficulty in measuring resilience. So do you know where you or your team or your organisation are at from a preparedness perspective? Is there insufficient resources and support, or executive sponsorship? So that top-down approach, and we can already see some areas coming through. We'll just see this update and see what everyone's most concerned about. So it looks like coming in first place, difficulty in measuring resilience, followed closely by insufficient resources and support, communication, team engagement, executive sponsorship. So it's sounding like the majority of people we've got on here today, and it's probably noted by the fact you're able to take time out of your busy days to spend some time learning and conversing on this topic with the likes of Mike, Sydney, and myself. We're not worried about the executive sponsorship in great detail. Things like measuring resilience, actually understanding where we sit as an organisation is potentially coming out as a big concern, followed up with effective insufficient resources and support to actually execute and drive our programs forward. We'll do our best to touch on those as we go through, and thank you for your contribution as we kick off the session today. No surprise, the area neuroscientists in the world find people being faced with extreme conditions quite a fascinating topic. Shocking, I know. And as such, have done a lot of research and continue to delve into this area to understand what are some of the driving factors, what are the things we can learn, and what are the areas that influence our decision-making and reactions when dealing with extreme situations. So first area here is the concept of stress response. Commonly, humans, when they're posed with an unexpected situation, will typically either go into one of three sort of default reactions: fight, flight, or freeze. I know when I first started studying this sort of area many years ago from a security perspective, fight or flight was the common one. Freeze is something we've come up with, or our lovely people in the scientific field have identified as a third other default area. But the main thing about this is a lot of this comes from an area of the brain known as the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for reasoning and decision-making. Something that we've identified that helps us react to these situations is the concept of neural plasticity. Apologies, it is 12 o'clock for me in the evening, and I might have a couple of word faux pas, but I'll do my best to limit that. When we think about neural plasticity, it's the concept of the brain that allows us to change and adapt on the fly based on learned experiences. So something that we're going to touch on throughout today's session is that element around learned experiences. Where these kind of areas kind of come to fruition when dealing with a live situation that we're presented with is the area or the concept of executive functioning, a cognitive process responsible for task management and decision-making. Again, an area that's taken from the outputs of our prefrontal cortex when we're dealing with these situations and need to make a decision to move forward. Why do we like to call this out as we set the scene and we start talking about resilience by design? Is the concept of being able to help train ourselves to prepare our brains for the unexpected and the ability to exercise that prefrontal cortex muscle by exposing it wherever we can to a variety of experiences and build muscle memory. If we think about when we want to get fit or train, we exercise. If we want to tone or put on muscle, we do weight exercises. The brain, from an exercising point of view and helping build up that library of learned experiences, is no different. And we want to do as many of these sort of activities and build that muscle memory and ingrain that into ourselves to make sure that we're prepared for these unexpected situations that we might be faced with as we move forward. At Illumina specifically, we've kind of taken the concept of when we're wanting to build resilience, we're kind of taking the approach a bit like if we think back to our childhoods, if everyone's ever watched the movie or read the book, The Never-Ending Story. We're continuously walking and going on a journey, looking to level up wherever we can through a variety of experiences. And we kind of break that down into three main areas that we're continuously working on. First one, resilience culture. So the concept of continuous practice through a vehicle, something like the concept of microsimulations, which I'll be showing you throughout some of our conversations today as a potential option to try and tackle some of these challenges, to continuously learn, create, and validate elements of our program. We then start to support that through decision insights. So the concept of making effective decisions from real-time data or information by, again, taking from validated sources, identifying, contextualizing, and escalating wherever we needed to, but again, data-driven decision-making on hand at the time that we need it, relevant to the situation we're dealing with. All of this is then kind of culminating in the ability to enable effective response through response orchestration. So using mechanisms or tools that allow for high-touch engagement to the right teams and the right stakeholders at the right time, continually collaborating together and giving us that constant review period or the ability to review what we're doing as we're progressing forward to adapt and change tact if we need to as the situation unfolds. Storytelling is key. I'm going to hand over to my friend Sydney to take us through the concept of storytelling as it relates to crisis and incidents.
Yeah, thanks, Leon. So related to the flywheel or resilience halo of sorts, I want to dig into that context piece you mentioned and talk a little bit about what you see here. We know that traditional risk management works very well in a well-ordered domain or a linear environment that we see here on this conveyor belt. So this is where we can apply our clearly defined steps, an SOP, a plan in a waterfall approach. So do A, then B, then C. So for example, fire alarm goes off. We know that we have to evacuate, muster, maybe a non-critical application goes down. We know exactly what we need to do when this occurs. It's a clear process. So these well-ordered domains, they tend to be structured, stable, what we might refer to as an incident rather than a crisis. They're usually pretty predictable, and that helps us because then we know how to respond. We know what to expect, therefore we know what to do. And again, that's where our plans and procedures tend to work best. However, everyone on this call knows that the crisis environment, we typically don't have this luxury. So, how do we define how we operate in a complex or non-linear environment? So let's take a look at what happens when we're in a crisis and what that might look like. If we had to draw what a crisis environment might look like, it could look something like this Jackson Pollock painting that you may be familiar with. But the Pollock teaches us two things. The first lesson is around pattern recognition. So we as humans perceive through patterns. And one of the challenges that we have, not only with this image and this series of paintings, is we can't recognize a pattern. We can't really perceive the meaning and what it's trying to tell us. Similar to what we may have experienced in a crisis, emerging crisis or during crisis response, right? We're not sure exactly what is going on. And in some cases, we might actually have an instance where we have two events occurring that we might try to link together, but not have information to prove that. So we may have a protest occurring outside one of our buildings, but we also might have someone trying to take down a piece of technology. And we may want to correlate those two things to create a pattern when there's not necessarily one there. So I think when we're talking about, Leon, context, it's just important to be aware of patterns and how we perceive things. The second lesson here with the Pollock is the storytelling. So there was a Stanford study that showed that 65% of our daily communications with each other is through storytelling and conversations. So in this image and in the crisis experience, we don't always have a clear story, right? Just like we don't have those clear patterns. So we'll need a different set of tools than we did from our previous incident, that well-ordered environment, to get us where we need to go. Typically, when we're planning for crisis, we may have specific playbooks for a cyber incident or a specific type of incidents, depending on our industry. But overall, when we're doing crisis planning, we're planning for an unknown event of an unknown impact, right? We're just setting our structure. So we just need to build that common ground for understanding a situation and have a framework to address it.
Makes a lot of sense. I personally resonate with the concept of whenever we converse, it's almost through that storytelling concept. And I think back to like learning history. And it's anytime we're looking at like a period in time or a particular event or activity, and we're breaking it down, it generally comes to like a story. Like you think about Spartan soldiers back in the Battle of Thermopylae, where you got the 300 people blocking an army of 1 million people, how we're able to make effect like work smarter, not harder in different areas, but it's done through an interactive or creative story. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so we talked through some of these challenges, right? Managing complexity. How do we structure our response in the unknown? How do we manage communications in these instances? And we'll talk through a solution here, but we want to provide familiarity where possible and a repeatable process. So yes, we need to clearly define our response structure and team, but we all know, depending on the type of scenario or situation, we're going to pull in different people. But how can we leverage familiar, whether it's technology, communications, and things, to make it so when we go into crisis, we're not adding unfamiliar things. We have enough unfamiliar things that we're facing. Another thing I would mention too is to, how can we embed, we're talking about resilience by design. Are there other places in our organization where we can work with to embed resilience or response capabilities that are already successful, whether that's with IT processes or other processes? So not only developing and your capability, but also starting to work with your cross-functional teams on that as well.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think this is kind of one of those first little pivots. We'll just do like a little bit of an example using Illumina as to when we're thinking about leveraging familiar or easily accessible communication channels. Sydney made a really good point there around we might need to engage with different parts of the organization or different people in the organization to actually understand or either to gather information, understand what's going on, impact, or actually get them to carry out a task. Now, this is a great example when we think about in a mid to large organization, any sized organization, you might have that core decision-making group that might be something like a crisis management team, a leadership team who's the central nexus of information as we're dealing with an unexpected situation. But we've also got this larger workforce and team available to us to help carry out and execute activities as we're moving forward. Now, if we're using a response or resilience platform like Illumina, does the whole organization need to have access and be trained on how to use that tool? No. So using communication tools and tapping into channels that they're familiar with, a great example would be things like SMS and email. These are things that almost everybody uses in every day-to-day life. Could even be extended out to things like Microsoft Teams or Slack or Zoom, if that's a tool that they're familiar communicating with, to receive an instruction. So the example I've got here is our communications dashboard in Illumina, and I've got 3 examples set up here. One might be like we need to let people know that we're dealing with the situation, so we can send that out en masse by SMS and email to a broad group in the organization. We can do things like two-way notifications, so like a poll notification to identify who's actually impacted or who has the ability to continue working in this new environment via freeform, setting out 3 or 4 different options and asking up to 10,000 people to respond, but very quickly understand the percentages or scope of who's able to continue working. But even taking it one step further to actually interact with those individuals through that communication channel via the concept of open reply notifications. So asking out a question and then just responding via SMS, typing a message back to a normal phone number. replying to a Teams notification, or replying to an email, to be able to very quickly understand we're communicating and centrally managing and coordinating the situation, but we're doing it through a process that's familiar and comfortable with those broader stakeholders in the organization. Driving engagement and operationalizing resilience. Mike.
Thank you, Leon, and thanks for shining a light on really the concept of meeting people where they are, and kind of not making people learn new tools to really participate and engage in a crisis or crisis engagement. So during a crisis, crisis generates a lot of uncertainty, but also a lot of interest and greater scrutiny. And while we all wish we were, an advanced AI that could perform under pressure, like ChatGPT and Cortana, I'm not Mike GPT. I'm a human being. So it's going to create uncertainty and emotional responses in me, when I'm participating in a crisis. So how do we get over that? We get over that by really trying to understand what's going on in all of the people on our teams. And here's 3 examples of some cognitive biases that might take over during a crisis. So one example, cognitive lock-in. When we're under stress, our ability to take information falls by up to 80%, and our complex reasoning abilities dramatically decrease. So the results are a tendency for us to make an initial decision and stick with it. So first is best understanding. But in the instant, we want to make sure that we're assessing kind of the full scope of all of the information that we have at our fingertips. Another way, decisions are affected by task saturation. When we focus on kind of too small of a problem and not taking a step back to assess what the larger situation is. So this is, really losing the forest for the trees. So we have a strong desire to solve problems in a crisis, and it's sometimes easy to relieve stress by doing that. It can lead to a tendency to focusing on things that may or may not be important, and the relative of importance of tasks shifts dramatically and dynamically during a crisis. And another example is that, is this groupthink idea where we're referencing, kind of this phenomenon where members of a group are more eager to come to an agreement and minimize group conflict versus coming to necessarily the right decision. So, putting together a framework of the engagement rules on how we can, kind of disagree during a crisis, but remain calm and remain a team is really important. So moving on to like some of the things that we're seeing with our customers and some of the challenges, we're really seeing, kind of the challenge of maintaining engagement with the resilience teams within the business and leadership during a crisis. Also, really operationalizing a repeatable and scalable process and framework to do that. And then the ability to broaden crisis teams based on scenarios. So making those teams and the engagement of them dynamic as things change throughout the situation. So how are we overcoming that with our customers? We're building team skills to quickly assess information and remove the noise. We don't know what's going to happen during a crisis, so we need to make sure that our teams have a cohesion, and also that we are able to give them the tools for them to assess a lot of information quickly and guide them to the right decisions with the technology. We're just humans, so we need the leverage of those frameworks and that technology to really be able to be effective during a crisis. And we want to continuously engage the teams during a business as usual and during a crisis event. So what this means is that we build that muscle memory that Leon and Cindy had mentioned before, and really kind of make it second nature to them. We don't want them learning during a crisis, right? We want them performing during a crisis. So building that muscle memory early on and often is really critical. We also want to make sure that we're socializing the good things that we're building. So providing and socializing frameworks and checklists are really key. During those crises, a lot of cognitive biases and kind of limitations kick in. So having those checklists at the ready is a really great centering and grounding tool to have for your different resilience teams. So how do we wrap all of this together? We can't do it manually, really. There's no real way, and or we would need a team. We would need those Spartan 300, Leon, again, to really have that army of resilience folks within an organization to bring that to light. But how do our teams of small and mighty resilience teams? How do we do this? We use technology, and I think Leon, you might have a great example for us.
Certainly do. So again, giving an example through Illumina. Within Illumina, when we think about response, whether that's real world or the concept of like on game day, we're dealing with the situation, or whether it's in that wargaming concept around preparation, building muscle memory through little bite-sized sort of activities we'll touch on in a bit more detail shortly. There's a feature in Illumina called our event rooms. Event rooms is a centralized workspace where teams can collaborate and coordinate their activities in a very agile manner for a given situation we're dealing with, whether that's one situation or several that are currently in flight across the organization as well. Now, there's a series of tools in here that I'll just touch on very, very briefly, just to give you a little bit of context. Embedding assessment tools to understand the severity and impacts of the situation we're dealing with, locations or areas and teams that are impacted, as well as then that collaborative element around free-form information capture. So a central place for all information about the incident we're dealing with. So facts, assumptions, processes that have been impacted or issues that we're identifying, ad hoc tasks and activities that we're coming up with on the fly. Generally, though, that would come second to this concept of playbooks. So playbooks is a term we've seen in the response world come more and more common. Predominantly originating from our friends in the IT space when building cyber response playbooks or tactical recovery playbooks. From an Illumina perspective, an Illumina playbook is a subset of tasks or similar to a checklist of old that is something that's able to be built once, managed across the organization, and then activated depending on the situation that we're dealing with. So whether that's something like a flood response, our team-based activity, or a set of actions that need to occur for a given location, that can be done through here. So depending on the situation we're dealing with, we go, okay, we know that we're dealing with our crisis management team, so we're going to activate our CMT playbook. We know that it is a flood response or a hurricane that we're dealing with, so we have those incident-based activities to activate as well. And if we've got a critical functional process that's been impacted that has a playbook associated to it to support recovery or manual interim processes, those can be called upon as well. The main takeaway here in this example is very much that scalable approach to very quickly in the very early stages of an incident or a training activity go, okay, this is what's occurred initially. So we know that we've got these things we can draw upon and start that response. So we're removing that need for fight, flight, or freeze and allowing the prefrontal cortex that I mentioned earlier to be open up to make that decision-making, because now we've got a way forward. We've got a path that we've been guided down straight away. So that initial shock of the situation we're dealing with starts to subside. And then we're open to then start making those free-form decisions that are unique to the situation or the occurrence that's currently underway. Within these playbooks, we have the ability to allocate them to a team, role, or a named individual. So again, that scalability, whether you're a slightly smaller scale organization that just needs a few basic things running, or if you're a big organization with a really large geographic footprint and you don't want to have to build 80 different flood response plans for your different locations or teams around the world. You can just have it once, but allow that to be pushed out across all teams and drawn upon by all teams for any given situation we're dealing with. Where this is ultimately moving towards is this concept of, okay, we've been notified about an incident that's a flood, or we've through an automated alert that might live in another part of Illumina, we're able to spin up the event room, pre-assess the situation, and bring through that playbook. So the minute participants start coming through, or those team members are activated, we're able to start that response activity as soon as possible and get to that nice, calm, level-headed approach of what next? What are we concerned about? How do we make sure that we move through this in a less impacted approach as possible? Building habits for agility. Sydney, I think you've got some fun stuff to talk about in this area.
Yeah, thanks, Leon. So we wanted to start with a poll from you all. Thanks for engaging with us and driving this discussion. Which areas of your organization do you believe would benefit most from incorporating resilience strategies? And we have a few options here you can kind of gauge. This is a cool one.
So it looks like we've got a few pre-submitted answers from some of our participants already.
Oh, awesome.
So some of the areas that we're looking to understand that are where you're looking to incorporate more strategic thinking: leadership and decision making, employee engagement and well-being, risk management and mitigation, operational processes and efficiency, and something that's not actually spoken about a lot, at least in some of the things I've been involved in over the years, is that customer satisfaction and retention element. Now, I know anyone out of the sales and growth world, top of mind, front and center, 7 days a week, 365, at home on a Saturday night, you're thinking about the customer and making sure we're holding on and growing those relationships. But when you think about it strategically across the organization, when a hurricane hits or a cyber attack occurs or there's a security incident down the road, is that always one front and center? It's one I find we're starting to see more and more come front, especially in the cyberspace. No shock. Governments and different regional institutions are saying this impacts everybody. Doesn't matter what organization you are. You need to think about the people that this is going to impact later down the path. But back to the crowd, as Sydney suggested, what are we concerned about today? Just so we make sure we can keep this front and center for you all. And it looks like the two winners we got at the moment: leadership and decision making, operational processes and efficiencies, followed very closely by employee engagement and well-being, risk management and mitigation. So I'm seeing a bit of a thread in those first two in lines with the concept of capability.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, like just kind of drawing off of your comment about customer satisfaction, that overall we see resilience and these different strategies being embedded into the design of and kind of updating of processes in organizations. For example, I came from pharma, and we're seeing where organizations are now tracking the patient journey from start to finish, and even including the patient in kind of the design of some of the even internal processes. And I think there's something for us as practitioners to be learned from that, which is, who are the people at the end of this? They're either our customers, our internal stakeholders, and we need to kind of consider that as we design our program. Hence kind of why we're here today, to talk about resilience by design. But yeah.
Completely agree.
I think one way that we, can incorporate this, and we all do here, right? We're familiar with exercises and training as great opportunities to do this, as Leon was saying, to overcome some of those cognitive biases and help us work through them and use our tools and templates in a more structured environment before crisis hits. So we know that people remember approximately 85% of what they experience or interact with, but only 10% of what they hear, meaning that our training and exercising is super important just from a pure retention perspective. And also have read different studies recently. We were talking about this with the Illuminar team on retention after you actually read something, and how, depending on what it is and for how long you're engaged in it, it can sometimes only be like 10 minutes. So using those experiences to collect your plan and process information, and then driving your updates out of that. How amazing has it been when you're in an exercise and you have identified a big action item that needs to be addressed that later saves you in an incident or crisis response? So that's what you're looking to do. You're also looking to push the boundaries of those biases and have someone who is a safe space to have those difficult conversations up front and not have them at time of crisis.
So, I think kind of bringing a lot of the topics together and kind of, putting a lot of the pieces that we've been talking about are, there's this just general increased complexity in everything that we're facing today. So, we have this pressure to, really be resilient, and that's kind of on everyone's mind. And what we want to do is, again, hopefully you're hearing a pattern here, is that, this is about building habits of agility and resilience, and baking it into the culture of your organization. So I think we were talking about different areas that could, use some improvements in this, but I think really it goes across the organization. And some of the top things that we're seeing is, really kind of addressing this by making resilience appropriate for each level, and again, meeting people where they are. So, I think back, years ago, we would test and exercise, process by process. Then we did some coordinated, coordinated testing and building habits that way. But all of those things were very, maybe once a year we did those things. And now with increased regulatory pressure to really prove that you have, capabilities for end-to-end scenario testing, where we're testing against, difficult or, rare but plausible, catastrophic events. That requirement and then the pressure from regulators and auditors is even higher today. So that standard keeps rising. So we need to kind of rise to meet it. And there is some differentiating between those, end-to-end testing and business continuity testing. And people often ask us, well, which should we do? And we usually say both, so that you're building that resilience at each level of your organization. So how do we do that though? How do we conduct these, multitudes of different tests? How do we document what we've learned? Because that is kind of the point of it, right? And I don't think anyone's perfect or any organization is perfect. So it's about documenting, understanding where your gaps are, and then improving upon them. So the way to get there is, you've probably heard us say this a lot, is deliberate practice. You have to practice what you need to do in the case of an emergency or in the case of a crisis, because otherwise you will not be using that muscle memory to really get through that. So we want to be able to practice and also define those severe but plausible scenarios and develop different frameworks. So we need different responses to each of these different scenarios, but we can't plan for everything. So we need these flexible frameworks that people can utilize during those crises to get them through, and to make sure that, again, that we're grounding back to that, that halo of resilience around your organization. And if we have that deliberate practice, we build a strong barrier, a strong halo around your organization. So again, unless you have that mighty army, you really need to leverage. You need leverage, and technology is a great way for you to get there. So I think, Leon, you might have maybe one more example up your sleeve of how Illuminator might be able to help with that.
Certainly do. So thinking about scalable, repeatable, high touch but low time cost approach is something we've done a lot of thinking about here at Illumina. And you heard me use the term earlier in the session, micro simulations, as a potential vehicle to help us achieve some of that capability and really start embedding resilience on a more routine, flexible, muscle memory orientated approach into the culture of our day-to-day operations across the organization. How do we do that? I'll take us back just a short step around thinking about, okay, what is the concept of a micro simulation? When we think about traditional exercising and those big activities that we commonly do at least once a year in most organizations, 2 to 3 hours of time, generally leadership style or executive sponsors that we're bringing into that room, scheduling, time and effort that goes into preparing those activities and then the outcomes of those activities are really, really powerful. And what do we do in those activities? It's everything from a little bit of a review of our framework, who's in the team, what are our roles and responsibilities, presented with the situation, assess it, determine what we do, how we react, what tools and processes we'd like to enact or call upon, are they fit for purpose, and get to a point of simulated stabilization. Then there's 3, 6, 9, maybe 12 months between before we get to do it again with that group. And we might not be able to do that same activity with other people that we want to call upon in the organization to support us in that game day response in real world. So the concept of microsimulation takes an element of one of those big scale activities, whether that's understanding a new checklist or playbook that's been made available and socializing it with the broader organization. If it's just assessing a situation and making sure that different people in different teams are confident, and that as an organization, we know that we're assessing things in a consistent manner. So we're escalating appropriately, or not fast enough or too fast, or getting things down to really understanding our role, but being able to bring new people into that team or that cohort of response leaders to act, but not have to wait 6 to 12 months till the next training or exercise activity we're doing. We can do this on a monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly, as frequently as needed, through a short 5, 10, maximum 15-minute activity. I'm going to take us through a couple of abridged versions of these short activities, so getting it down to 2 to 3 minutes, but in reality, a participant might spend about 5 to 10 minutes. So one example is leading back to this concept of socializing new materials or new tools or processes that are available in our teams. Is an example for one where we've got a new playbook available and we want to make sure that people know their role within that playbook. So as a participant, I'd be brought in to Illumina. Now, I just might receive an SMS with a link or an email to say, please log in, or we might bring people together in a bit of a multiplayer style environment to work together to say, okay, this is a situation we're dealing with. Let's see how we all go together. To kick it off, because we've only got a short time window, we present them with a very short but very clearly definition of what's the scenario we're dealing with as an example.
The Weather Bureau has today issued new warnings for a fast-moving hurricane due to make landfall on Tuesday. Hurricane Denise already has sustained winds of 125 miles per hour and is expected to intensify into a Category 4 hurricane ahead of making landfall, bringing dangerous conditions as it tracks inland. While the exact path of the hurricane is still undetermined, heavy impacts are expected early next week as conditions continue to deteriorate. Preparations have begun across the state as authorities, businesses, and residents scramble to brace for potentially deadly impacts of destructive winds, widespread flooding, power outages, and road closures.
So very quickly, in the first 60 to 90 seconds, we know what we're dealing with or what we might be simulating for this particular activity. From here, we're going to guide the users through some very basic elements of where they can find information and what we actually want them to do in this particular activity. So in this particular scenario, we want to make sure that we're accessing the appropriate playbook for this scenario. We're finding the highest priority task that relates to me and my role, and potentially then might ask them to do another action depending on where they are on that capability journey and what we're looking to do. One little point out I like to make when we think about microsimulations is we commonly start at a foundational level. So starting at like that entry level common factor around, let's just pretend this is new for everybody. So we really provide them the ingredients on what they might need to use and what they need to do in a given situation. But then if you've got a team that's a little bit more experienced and a little bit further down the maturity journey, we can get a bit more tactical and complicated with the activities we're looking to do, whether that's things like start to build out communication strategies or issue communications to parts of the organization. That can be done. So we're able to fit it to the capabilities of your team at the time. But in the example I mentioned before is, okay, we want to actually go, okay, guys, we've got a new playbook and here it is as an example. So how do you access it? And then within here, a very clear pointer around, okay, what's the role that we actually want you to carry out as part of this? So I'd be looking for anything that relates to my role. So I might be the communications person, and that's a high priority task. So I actually want to make sure we're doing X, Y, or Z. Once I'm confident with that, I can either make a comment or mark it as complete in this particular simulation. Return myself back, but a very important element of microsimulations is actually closing that feedback loop. One of the key call outs of challenges from our attendees today was around how are we measuring how we're doing from a preparedness perspective. So a very simple way to help us understand that is for a very simple conversational feedback loop. So that's actually giving our participants say in, did you find this effective? Are you confident to use this? Do you think we've missed anything? So it can be open-ended questions all being centrally gathered in one place, or potentially measured on a scale of, do we think this is working for us? And actually, a bit like Sydney, Mike, and I have been saying to our participants today, we don't just want to speak to you. And I was actually slightly giggling to myself when Sydney was talking through the 85% versus 10%. There's a clear reason we're trying to get you to be involved in the conversation. We don't want to be that 85%. We want you to be that 10% through experience. So sorry, the 85% from experience, not the 10% just from listening. But again, same thing as resilience champions in our organization, handing over the direction and the navigation of our journey to actually say, what do you think we should be doing? And everyone has a role to play, but everyone also has a say in how is this going to work for us. Mike, I think you've got something to add on to this one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I was just, as you're going through this demo, I noticed something new today every time I, kind of talk with you all. So we're, kind of going through this micro simulation, and I, absolutely find the power in it. The media actually, really engaging and draws you in and kind of, again, puts you in that mindset. So really kind of gets you in character for, dealing with a crisis like a, hurricane coming at our company assets and things like that. So, and those are the types of things that our customers deal with, all the time. And then, when we're talking about muscle memory and building, the practice here, I really love the kind of the knowledge at the point of action during the micro simulation. It kind of draws you around the screen and really points you right to where you need to go. And I was thinking in my head, I was like, that is actual muscle memory. I'm training my eyes where to go on the screen. I'm training my hands to, where to bring my mouse over. So we were always talking about muscle memory as this sort of, theoretical metaphor, but now I'm like, oh, we're actually doing that with our eyes and our hands, and kind of that repetition gets you, oriented into the right parts of the screen. Even though this is virtual, that we again are those. I'm not my chat GTP kind of guy. I'm a human, so I need to train myself to do these things. So yeah, I really kind of noticed that these series of demos that you've done today.
100%. I think there's just and again, talking to that point about the repeatability. So that was a very short example around, okay, we've got something new that we want to surface. Maybe we want to do something more around understanding what are the impacts to our organization based on a situation. So if a rogue Mike GPT decided to hack one of our main vendors and now we've lost our CRM system, what does that mean for us as an organization, and being able to share this out with a broader group? Again, we've got the ability for, if we're targeting those key response characters within our organization, so members of response teams, they'd be being brought into Illumina. But if it's, say, like the team leader on the customer service desk down in our e-commerce center, thinking people like your Amazons or Walmarts or things like that, maybe they just receive an SMS link to said video and then an open-ended poll question. That is a micro simulation from like a headless text sort of approach. So we're actually getting them to think about, oh, maybe I would see something on the news and then I might receive a message from my crisis team to say, we need you to do something, or we need you to call your staff, or whatever the case may be. So like similar version, the ability to go, okay, different scenario. I won't make you all see the other people.
A major cyber attack has knocked out one of the world's largest software providers, disrupting the operations of.
So the concept of not necessarily cyber to us as an organization, but something that we use. So what is the impact of that? So picture hypothetically, and I hope there's no one from here, but like picture things like your Salesforces or your Oracles getting taken down for a particular reason. What does that mean to us? We're not the ones at risk from the criminal element, but we've now got an operational impact. What does that look like? So again, we're doing that continuous muscle memory of, if we're calling upon you, here's the information, here's tasks, here's the playbook we want you to do. But as the purpose of the activity, we actually want you to carry out an impact assessment. So we want you to identify how severe the operational impacts if it was system X versus system Y, and being able to scale that out across the organization. Again, always big fans on, yes, please, Sydney.
That ability to document throughout and being able to go back if anyone's been through, a big crisis or incident, and you have to go back and collect all of that information and timestamps, and that's very cumbersome. So this can help aid in that. And also, as you showed us that functionality around follow-up, That's another thing too. We're always trying to improve our playbooks as we go. So I think to have both of those in one place is very valuable. We know there may be some things elsewhere, but if you have a primary place, that's really key.
Completely agree. And I know anyone in the tech advocacy world, I'm looking at Mike GPT right now in particular, is that I know back in my consulting days, supporting clients through either real world game day activities or through those war gaming exercises, that lovely question at the end of the session, okay guys, we need your WhatsApp screenshots, we need your emails, we need your physical notes, we need someone to take photos of the whiteboards. It's all being captured in one place. And to that, by extension to that, we're in a remote environment. I haven't think I've spoken to anyone who hasn't got either themselves or one of their colleagues working from home 80% of the week. So how do we not let that impact our ability to respond? And again, embed that level of resilience from a coordination and response orchestration perspective. It's all being captured in one place. It's being updated in real time. But again, to your point there, Sydney, when we think about it from a how do we stand as an organization today? How are we measuring? How are we doing capability wise? We've now got all this data to report on, and it's really easy to pull out and look and then compare against that notional feedback that we can do in sort of like a hot debrief through that like open-ended survey questionnaire at the end as well.
Yep, absolutely. I think, Leon, that goes back to the leverage. We just need leverage. We can't do all of this stuff manually. We don't have the time. And so I think, having a platform like Illuminar in place that really does give you that centralization and real-time collection mechanism, like Sydney mentioned, to bring it all together. So again, we're all about efficiency and effectiveness when we're working with our customers, and technology is often the path to that.
Well, I'm a big fan of the vehicle to success, or that vehicle to support us. So again, when I think about the second concern from everyone who's joined us today being around that limited resources, for me, whenever I see that, my bias there is it's okay. I don't have a team of people. I'm a team of one, or I'm a team of half, or I'm the operations person, but I've been asked to do business continuity or crisis manager. So I'm not even a team of one. Like I'm a team of like 0.2. So using that as a way to bring this out and again become that trusted advisor and champion the organization versus a doer. To me, that is a clear success factor around have we embedded it, or are we on the journey to embedding this truly? Is if you've got this in everyone's mind, not every 5 minutes of every day, but they know about it. And it's not this, oh, Leon's coming at me to do a business continuity training every 3 to 12 months, 3 months to 12 months. It's, I need to go to Leon if I've got a business continuity question, not the other way around. I see that as a very powerful vehicle to success. One way, just as an example, for those on the call or on the session today, if you're thinking about looking and going, well, how effective and how do I go from zero to hero as it relates to operationalizing a highly engaging program to redesign our approach to resilience? An example of this is what we've been talking of late with some of our customers around a scrimmage program. So setting that line in the sand around, okay, we need to understand where we are today and how we get from behind it to in front of it. How do we move that forward? And one example of that is the scrimmage program, which is a hyper-focused 12-week program where we do a range of 15-minute micro simulations across a cohort or several cohorts in your organization through Illuminar, provided with some dedicated resilience supports and guidance to say, this is the tool set, let's look at where you're at, what do we need to identify, who do we want to work with, to actually successfully measure how we're doing today, and then reassess that and review and provide feedback at the end of that initial 3 months. But also by extension, having access to Illuminar for the months after that to support you in any other game day activities you might be experiencing. Keeping it light touch, if this is something that sparks a bell of interest, in just a moment, we're going to put up some contact details. And feel free to reach out to myself or anyone at the Illuminar team to learn more about how this might work for you and your organization.